I'd like to ask Mark Mills to please come up. For those, I can't imagine those who don't know who Mark is, but Mark is the director of the National Center for Energy Analytics. He worked previously in the Reagan administration in the White House science office, and is a widely followed scholar and author. He's the director of the National Center for Energy Analytics, as I mentioned, a distinguished senior fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, contributing editor for the City Journal, a faculty fellow at Northwestern University School of Engineering, and an author of several books, notably The Bottomless Well, which Bill Gates here says found the only book he's ever read that really explains energy. I can attest to that. And if you think you understand energy, reading the book will make you realize very quickly that you don't, unless you have a firm grasp on things like enthalpy and exergy and things of that nature. There's still a lot more to learn about energy. And so hopefully Mark can help teach us some of that today.
Thank you, Adam. And there's the word enthalpy and exergy don't appear in The Bottomless Well. I could tell you I avoided the physics for reasons. You don't write popular books and use physics terms. I'm going to talk about technology as a framing way to think about the future, both the economy and energy. Thinking about where energy demand will go and when energy supply will go is anchored in guessing where the economy will go fundamentally. And where the economy is going to go is determined fundamentally by large macro forces, of course, social forces. We just heard from Neil, I thought a terrific summation of cycles in history, which I'm a believer in. And I'm an amateur historian, but I had to become a historian to study the forecast technology. You have to study the past of technology. And the realities of energy demand are what will drive supply. So I'm going to begin by really focusing on the demand side. And since Adam and Lee, and thank you again for inviting me to join you all. Adam and Lee's work, by the way, as an aside, is the work and writings that I admire at the top of the list of my readings. They're brilliant analysts, thorough and well-documented, rare resistance to social memes and trends, which is very difficult to do when you're trying to forecast. So they like magazine covers, as do I. You can cherry pick magazine covers. I cherry pick these two for the obvious reasons. Jensen was on the cover of Time magazine in 2021. That's when I wrote my latest book called The Cloud Revolution. And of course, you would not say that was peak NVIDIA in 2021. That would have been a buying opportunity. In this particular case, you would have been very happy in your portfolio at the moment. And I will say on an investor cruise, I did recommend NVIDIA contemporaneous with that time. So it was a good pick to ride the thesis, which I'll talk about in a minute. And of course, in April of 1979, the cover of Time magazine had 3 Mile Island on it. These two phenomenologies, the intersection of the worlds of bits and atoms, are extremely well epitomized by these two covers. You all have been, doubtless, if you follow these domains, reading about how artificial intelligence, driven by GPUs, specifically from NVIDIA, are creating an epic demand for electricity. And then now the extraordinary enthusiasm from the tech community, rediscovering the benefits of nuclear energy and the fissioning of atoms, as particularly the uranium atom. And in March 28th, 1979, the accident at 3 Mile Island began the end of the commercial nuclear industry in the United States. So this was a pivot point that marked a 50-year nadir for the commercial nuclear industry. I know I was there. I was at the accident at 3 Mile Island for the week of the accident and spent the next 7 or 8 years of my life defending the virtues of nuclear energy, clearly unsuccessfully, since the industry went into U.S. demise. So what these two domains tell us a lot, but I'm going to step back up before I come to the energy specific part at a macro level and propose a couple of sort of framing ways to think about how we can look at the future of technology, which again will drive the economy, which again in turn is what drags energy demand along. You would want to ask yourself a very simple sort of macro question. What's the main difference between how people lived at the time of the Neanderthal man and how people live today? And the answer isn't that we've discovered new materials. The materials that exist in the universe have always existed. The energy forces have always existed. What's different about civilization is what we know, our knowledge, information. Technology is the instantiation of what we know, how we understand nature, natural forces, and the materials and energy forces of the universe. And we use that knowledge to take materials that have always existed, essentially, and use energy to combine them in unique ways to make technologies that create the products and services that define humanity, that give us the ability to survive nature's predations. Nature's always been trying to kill humanity. And before recorded history, nature wants to kill humans, whether it's from natural disasters, from pestilence, disease, viruses. Nature is out to get us. So we use technology to protect ourselves. We use it for safety, for speed, for convenience, comfort, beauty itself, entertainment are all fundamentally driven by the products and machines and tools we create by combining atoms in unique ways using energy with our knowledge. So energy demand is a result of that. And as a consequence, to think about where energy demand is going, you'd want to predict technology. And you'd predict technology because, as Robert Solow said famously, for which he got his Nobel Prize, technology is the dominant engine of growth, with human capital investment in second place. And this is an economist saying that. I mean, the human nature matters. It always matters. I mean, humans are, in fact, some anthropologists have suggested we should call humans Homo faber, not Homo sapien, because technology, as Neil said, is not exogenous to human beings. We exist to make machines in effect. We convert products in nature that don't exist in forms that we will want them to be in with energy and knowledge. The interesting thing about it is that, and this sort of plays on something that Neil said, that technology is not only not an exogenous force, what you can do with technology, what we actually do with it, how we instantiate our knowledge has a lot to do with what do we believe. And in fact, one of my favorite, perhaps my favorite economic historian, Joel Mokyr, wrote at the beginning of one of his latest books on economics that economic growth depends more than most economists think on what people believe. He doesn't mean believing in magic. He means confidence and faith in the future, all the kind of social constructs that matter to human beings. So I'm going to talk about the patterns of technology that are predictive and paint a very high-level picture for you, not a cycle. This is the Adam and Lee's famous graph. I love this graph. I cut and pasted it at the top here to point out not only that I'm a believer in cycles as a physicist, I study cycles. As an economic historian of sorts, I study cycles. But patterns are interesting, and a cycle is a form of pattern, but it's not the only kind of pattern. So I want to point to a technology pattern that's interesting. If you look at the United States circa 1820, this is a painting from New York City in 1820, the per capita income of America was about $2,000, per capita GDP rather, not income. If you went 100 years later, it had grown substantially, 250% in real terms, about $5,000 per capita GDP in America. In the 100 years since 1920, we've seen the per capita income in same inflation-adjusted terms grow to $70,000. So what happened? It wasn't because we have a more stable economy, but because people love each other more, because there weren't boomers then. It wasn't because of rule of law improved. The Constitution was the same then and now. Our fights were the same then as now. We've had wars, horrible wars from 1920 to our time. What was the principal difference? Because the principal difference was in this pattern. There was in 1920 an episode that's not cyclical, but episodic and rare in history, a confluence of astounding advances in technology in the three specific spheres that define everything. Everything that's possible. It begins with materials from the earth, hence commodities. Everything that exists that we use, every product and service, begins with mining somewhere. Everything, not some things. Everything. Everything in our society begins with mining, and we use energy and our knowledge to make machines, and that confluence is what creates everything that exists. In the 1920s, what we saw was in the three domains of materials and machines and information. These are different domains of industry, different domains of skill, different domains of education. Each of them were undergoing a profound technological revolution quasi-independently. That was not the invention of, but a period in which the commercial viability of automobiles became possible. Aircraft, electric power plants in the materials domain, alloys became feasible at scale. Polymers, the invention of plastics and synthetic materials, and the pharmaceutical industry. And the information domains, that was when we saw the viability of telephony, the radio, as Neil mentioned, and the beginning of the professionalization of science itself. The confluence is what drove the largest expansion in wealth in real terms in human history, that next century. Yes, we also had wars, we did bad things, and nasty stuff happened, but the world's economies continued to expand. I contend, and as I mapped out in my book, The Cloud Revolution, that we are at a similar, we have witnessed today a similar pattern in each of exactly the same domains, that the technologies that underlie each of those domains are undergoing a profound revolution that in combination create the potential for economic growth cycle as great as we saw in the last century. We're witnessing new classes of materials, not just bioelectronics, but things called metamaterials, materials that exhibit properties that don't exist in nature. A negative index of refraction. What that means is the real capability to build a material that is invisible. We already have built materials that are invisible to radar. Light's a little tougher. Smart materials are self-healing materials that already exist and are being used in pre-commercial ways. Of course, in the machine domain, we have autonomy, which is a distinction with a profound difference. Machines that operate themselves dynamically in the environments that we live in. We have molecular scale manufacturing and, of course, biomanufacturing. All these things are not theoretical, but already invented in the pre-commercial stages of application. And of course, in the information domain, and the reason I called my book The Cloud Revolution, we have the advent of infinite data. That is, we have the capacity with ever more sophisticated low-cost sensors to collect data about things that scales are literally infinite in scale. There's no limit to how much data we could want about things, the granularity of the data or the precision of the data. And we have tools now to collect data at scales that defy a numerical categorization. And of course, we have artificial intelligence. And when I wrote my book, when Jensen was on the cover, nobody had heard of ChatGPT, but everybody in the computing industry, where I began my career, was intimately familiar with AI, not just its dawn in the 50s, but its instantiation in the early 2000s. It's been a tool, it's been used now for 2 decades. And of course, the cloud infrastructure itself. Those things come together, lead to new products and services. So I'll come back to energy, but let me jump ahead and make the observation. Human beings invent energy demand. It's not some feature that just is relevant to our existence. Yes, we need energy for food, which is the fuel of life, but it's not food energy use that drives the demand for energy. You know this by just a simple arithmetical experiment. The last half century in the United States, total consumption and production of agriculture has gone up about 80%. That's roughly equal to the population growth. And we use energy to produce food. But in that same last half century, total industrial production to make the things, products, goods, toys, entertainment, productivity machines, total industrial production has gone up 300% in the same half century. That's where energy demand comes from. If you put it in dollar terms instead of BTU terms, because no one can visualize a BTU or any forms of energy that physicists use to measure things, but you could imagine dollars, your investors. $1 billion of cars, when they're built, consumes $200 million of energy over the 10 years of the use of those cars. There was no demand for energy for cars till the invention of cars. There was no demand for energy for airplanes till the invention of airplanes, self-evidently. $1 billion of aircraft leads to about $300 million of fuel use, today's prices, over a decade. If you build chip factories to make all the magic tools that we take for granted today, every $1 billion of chip fabs leads to over $300 million in energy consumed for a decade. And if you build $1 billion of data centers, the new infrastructure of our modern era, that leads to over $600 million of energy consumed over a decade of operating those. And if you infuse those data centers with racks full of GPUs to do artificial intelligence, inference, and learning, then the energy demand of those data centers rises to more like $2 billion over the decade. There is a phase change in the infrastructure of what we use to operate our society. And that phase change, of course, is the information infrastructure. The U.S. private investment in information technology equipment and software, one way you could measure it, and you could see this data series from the Fred going from essentially non-existent at the era that Neil talked about when we didn't imagine we needed more than 7 computers. I will say, as a matter of sort of a sidebar, it wasn't Bill Gates' imagination to get to a PC. It was Arthur C. Clarke. Arthur, you can find he's our science fiction writer and a scientist, and you can still find on YouTube right now an interview he gave in 1974, standing in a computer room and talking about the future of computing. And he predicted then, in no uncertain terms, that computers would soon be small enough to fit on your desktop or even in a purse, and that everybody would want one because it'd be so useful. He was prescient. Microsoft was formed in 1975. A year later, I think maybe Bill Gates probably heard the interview. That generation gave us this. But the infrastructure is measurable in a variety of ways. If you look at how the Federal Reserve tracks business spending in the 4 categories: equipment, buildings, machines, and information things. We've been spending more on information CapEx for all of this 21st century than we have in any of the others. If you measure where the information is being stored, used, processed, manipulated, we crossed the Rubicon 10 years ago where majority of the data in percentage terms, because the quantity of data is expanding literally exponentially. It's the only exponential expansion that's going on in society, is in quantity of data being produced, processed, and used. We crossed the Rubicon where the majority of it's in the cloud, not in your devices. Your devices have much more data in it now. Those of us of a certain age will remember being in awe of getting a megabyte of storage on a portable device, and you take for granted now having terabytes in your pocket. It's not just the quantities, it's where it is and where it exists. We are in the process of building, and we're at the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end of the construction of the infrastructure that we could call the cloud. All infrastructures go through very similar patterns, but they don't go through cycles, in the sense that once you've built canals, you don't build them again. Once you build highways, you generally get to a saturation point, how many highways you really want, with marginal slow growth after that. We are in the early days of the cloud. What's interesting about the cloud is it's already the biggest infrastructure humanity has ever built. If we measure it in sort of square feet terms, at the center of the cloud, of course, are data centers. Massive buildings the size of a Walmart, measured in typically million square feet for the enterprise class data centers. There are more than 5,000 enterprise class data centers in the world today. We're building hundreds of them a year. If you compare that to skyscrapers of comparable square footage, there's only 1,500 of those in the world today, and we're building maybe a dozen of those a year on average. If you measure the size of the infrastructure in miles, the world has something like 40 million road miles of all kinds. It's a lot of road miles to carry energy-consuming vehicles. If you look at it in equivalent terms of virtual and physical, that's wired and wireless network, we're over 100 billion infrastructure, information superhighway miles of connectivity. If you measure it in just dollar terms of CapEx building energy-consuming hardware, we're running over 1.5 trillion a year in spending on building the global cloud in all its forms. Total utility spending to produce electricity globally is but $1 trillion a year. If you measured it in terms of what consumers are doing with this stuff, businesses buy services. We can measure global spending on cloud services. We've grown from tens of millions of dollars a decade ago, approaching $1 trillion. If you measured it just in the square feet build rate, what you see is a graph on your right, which is the millions of square feet being built globally of data centers. You'll notice that we've reached a proverbial inflection point where we've got takeoff. In the next 3 years, we're going to build more square footage of data center than that exist in total in the world today. A single square foot of data center consumes 100 times more power today than a typical skyscraper. And the data centers that are being built now, their power consumption per square foot is doubling and tripling, not just because of AI, but because of the advances in computing. This will lead to a lot of energy consumption, to which I won't spend a lot of time on the efficiency trope, that most pundits and most apologists in the tech community who are embarrassed by this, hand wave efficiency will solve the problem. We're going to make the compute more efficient. As any student of what Adam and Lee Wright knows, Jevons paradox. Jevons knew that it was not a paradox. He wrote specifically His words were, "It may appear a paradox that improving efficiency of coal mining will reduce consumption, but it will increase the consumption of coal." So what we can look at is every category of every product or service that humanity cares about. You improve efficiency, it means you reduce the cost of the service or the product. That's true in computing. If you draw a logarithmic X curve of compute efficiency against compute traffic, you see the graph on your left. You see it in aviation. You still will see it yet in computing. If you've studied this industry, as I have done for a very long time, my first job, in fact, was in a semiconductor fab. Couldn't get a job as a physicist, so I got hired as an engineer, which was a blessing, a true blessing in disguise, because I like making things. And I spent time in both basic engineering and basic physics early in my career. In fact, I began my career contemporaneous when Arthur C. Clarke made the forecast about computing in 1974 in a fab. And I knew it was right because I was one of the engineers designing ever smaller integrated circuits. You knew that you could make them smaller. Why did you make them smaller? We didn't make them smaller because we wanted to be smaller. Nobody cared about small computers, by the way. What they cared about was faster computers. Faster computers were only made possible by making them smaller. So you made them smaller so you could switch the transistors quicker, which meant the energy use went down and the overhead went down, and they got faster and faster. That's Moore's law. Is Moore's law over? Well, this is the graph from both TSMC and all the leading edge producers. The leading edge chip manufacturers don't theorize about where they're going to be in 5 or 10 years. They've already designed where they're going to be in 5 or 10 years. I know this from experience, and you know this would be true in every industry of scale. You know where you're going to be 5 years from now because you've already invented it. If you haven't already invented it, you can't build it 5 years from now. Inventions today are interesting, but they don't tell you anything about the future. It's inventions in the extremely recent past. What we see with these two graphs is that not only is transistor density continuing on a logarithmic curve for the next decade, so is compute efficiency. It's going to continue improving at the same rate. This will lead to increased energy consumption from computing. How do I know? Well, the computer in your pocket or your notebook, wherever you got your smartphone, that has compute power equal to 10,000 mainframes of the era of the 1980s when mainframes were ascendant. 10,000 times the compute power in your pocket. If your iPhone or Android device had the energy efficiency of compute in 1980, it would use more electricity than a Manhattan skyscraper. But the reason there are 400 million of these devices manufactured a year and billions of them in the world is because they're more efficient, and collectively they use more electricity than the country of Japan by a factor of 2. That's what efficiency does. It increases demand for things that people care about. What people really care about in markets, it tells you a lot about where energy demand is going to come from, is not the compute efficiency per se, it's the economic efficiency of compute. So if you mapped out computations per second per dollar, inflation adjusted terms, how much, that's the price of a computer, but it's not just the price of a computer, it's the price of the service in a cloud. I don't care how I get access to the computation, whether it's a service or a handheld device. What the measure of merit is computations per second per dollar. That improved at about 7-fold per decade during the electromechanical era, adding machines. It improved during the first electronic era, the transistors and discrete transistors and early computers, at a blistering pace of 16-fold per decade. This is a pretty big deal. I mean, I'm talking here about economic efficiency. Imagine beginning of the decade, by the end of the decade, you got 16 times more economic value than you did at the beginning of the decade. Would you use more of that thing that you got 16 times more of it per dollar at the end of the decade than before? It's a nonlinear effect. If you improve the efficiency that much, economic efficiency, the demand doesn't go up 16-fold. It may go up 50-fold, 100-fold. It depends on the market and application. In the cloud era, which began roughly at the turn of the century, the rate of improvement of this metric, computations per second per dollar, by putting compute into cloud and making a utility function out of it and making it ubiquitously available through wired and wireless communications, it's been improving, at an economic measure again, by 1,000-fold per decade. At the end of this decade, a decade ago compared to now, you get 1,000 times more economic performance from compute than you did just 10 years ago. That pace has not slowed. This is a technological trend of some significant consequences, profoundly underestimated, both in terms of being predictive of where the economy is going to go, what we're going to use compute to do, and in terms of what the energy demands are from compute. To give you a sense of how big a deal this is, I mapped this out in my book. I tried to think about what would be an analog that was relevant to the 20th century. Well, the advent of personal transportation is equivalent to the advent, if you like, simplistically, of personal computing. There was no personal transportation to the car. So if I took a metric equal to computations per second per constant dollar, think of this in these terms. How many feet per hour per constant dollar do you get for a transportation service? You can find these data out. They exist in history. We know lots about the fares to transport people from the times of the Egyptians to our present time. And what's interesting is that it was flat. Shipping, traveling by ship or stagecoach in terms of the product you got, feet per hour per dollar was about the same. The railroad took you up tenfold, hence the boom in the railroad. You get 10 times more feet per hour per dollar. The car took you up another tenfold. Aircraft took us up another tenfold. We got a 1,000-fold improvement in this key metric of feet per hour per dollar over the century of the 20th century. That propelled the 20th century, and literally and figuratively and economically. It took a century to get a 1,000-fold improvement in that metric. We got a 1,000-fold improvement in the key information metric in 10 years, and it's continuing. I put drone there, by the way, because whether it's a flying drone or an autonomous car, it's really the only path to get the next increment in improvement in feet per hour per dollar. The rocket ship and the Falcon Heavy, and as exciting as I am excited by Elon Musk's success, is if you are thinking in terms of space travel as a viable human general transport, you can see it regresses back. It's an extremely expensive way to move people. So now we have something unique going on that's captured everybody's attention. The excitement is all about AI. It's a nonstop drumbeat about AI, both from an energy demand perspective. And ironically enough, to my first two pictures of magazine covers, there are those who are apocalyptic, that the advent of AI is equivalent to the advent of nuclear weapons. It's a catastrophic event, the destruction of labor. Humanity is facing the existential threat of the singularity arriving. This is all silly stuff, by the way, and I won't spend a lot of time explaining just how silly it is. AI is a profoundly useful tool, but it is equivalent in general technology history terms as the arrival of the jet engine, which is a profoundly useful tool put on aircraft. In 1958, the first general commercial service of a jet aircraft airplane began, the Boeing 707. At that point in history, there was already more than 3 decades of aviation service, general service for citizens. And there has already been something on the order of a 100-fold increase in air traffic and massive expansion in an infrastructure to serve global aviation by 1958. But the real inflection in the curve for global aviation began in 1958 and 1960, when you took that infrastructure and the aircraft and the design of an aircraft itself and added a profoundly different propulsion system, the jet engine. You still needed the airplane. You still need wings. You still need the runways. You still need radar. But that was the takeoff. AI in general terms is the equivalent of the jet engine on compute. AI doesn't function without other compute. It doesn't function without communications. Every AI machine learning algorithm has a boatload of conventional compute, conventional memory all around it. In fact, it's an accelerant for the use and production of conventional compute and memory, because AI's input, other than electrons, is data. It's profoundly data hungry. Collecting data, moving data requires conventional compute. What it does is something that's profoundly different than compute today. It doesn't compute, it infers. Humans infer, they don't compute. We guess. So AI doesn't replace compute. It adds a feature to compute that's profoundly useful. When you drive your car, it doesn't have to be like a railroad track exactly on a rail. It has to be pretty right, mostly right, give or take some specific boundaries. That's inference, different than compute. A railroad track, in a sense, is like compute. Driving your car is like inference. A computer that can do inference is very different than a computer that can do a computer. Guess roughly what the right answer should be. It doesn't have to be 1 + 1 = 2. If it's close to 2, that's good enough when you're driving. This is true for so much in human affairs. So where is AI going to make a big play? Well, a really big play is a demographic play. The graph on your left is a ratio in America of the old to the young, the number of people that are over 18 to the number that are over 60. sort of under 18, over 60. There were twice as many people under 18 as over 60. As recently as 1980, we crossed the Rubicon where they were equal in quantity in the United States a couple of years ago. And of course, all of us know demographically that we have a birth dearth, and there won't be enough legal or illegal immigrants to reverse it, but we can stabilize it. What will you do with the birth dearth and the aging of the workforce, especially of the skilled workforce, the so-called silver tsunami? You need machines to amplify the humans to keep productivity going. AI does in information work and ultimately in labor work, its critical role is replacing humans in the routine. Routine things computers and machines are good at doing. It's very, very hard to do much of what humans do with machines, but AI makes that easier. And if you look at the data on the absolute number of human beings that are in the US workforce doing two kinds of work, knowledge work and we'll call it non-knowledge work or the skilled trades. So manual labor, knowledge work, and you divide those into two subcategories. This is Federal Reserve data of repetitive versus non-routine, so routine versus non-routine work. What you find is that the US workforce has been absolutely flat in the number of people doing routine work, and all growth has been in non-routine labor and non-routine knowledge work. Where would you get more people to do both non-routine labor and non-routine knowledge work? Well, you would take them out of the routine tasks, like computers do that, upskill the people into the non-routine. That's already happening in the skilled trades. And we'll begin to see that reflected in what kind of education people choose. We've already seen a decline in applications the last 2 years to colleges and universities to obtain degrees that get you a $30,000 starting salary versus going into the apprenticeships where you get, if you're a longshoreman now, an $80,000 starting salary, and a mid-career salary of $150,000 compared to 80% of college graduates with a prospect of a mid-career salary of $100,000. AI will upskill and move all these employees, workers, and citizens into categories of higher salary. And it will all come from the infrastructure that we need, the global data center, the global cloud. This is a Goldman Sachs graph they put out a few months ago to try to forecast where global data center electricity consumption was going to go. And there's two important parts about this graph. And of course, the forecast is a light gray, and you can see they think it's going up. What they pointed out correctly is only about 10 or 20% of the unexpected electricity demand from data centers comes from AI. And in their forecast, which is roughly right, I think, by 2030, about 20 to 30% of the net growth in electric demand will be coming from AI. All the rest of it's from conventional compute. What AI is doing is accelerating conventional compute as well. If you're not terawatt hour sophisticate, just as a calibration point, 1,000 terawatt hours is the country of Japan. So what they're saying is that data centers by themselves will shortly use as much electricity as the country of Japan. But they're undercounting. This is a study I did 10 years ago, which was provocatively titled "The Cloud Begins with Coal." And I titled it that way because it was true. The cloud began in roughly 2000 and became a infrastructure of significance by 2010. And during that time period, globally, the primary source of new electricity at that time, globally, was coal. So ipso facto, if you have an expanding marginal demand, the marginal supply at that time was largely coal. Going forward, it's going to be the cloud begins with, you will know the answer. It's not uranium, it's natural gas, which I'll show why in a second. I made a forecast at that time, a little red triangle at the top right, of where cloud electric consumption would be. And it looks like I was right. I did do a band. When you're forecasting, you have to have bands. But I picked the red triangle. And this is cloud, meaning data center plus networks, plus the energy used to manufacture the networks and the data centers. You have to do that because unlike steel buildings, as Neil noticed, some of the steel in these buildings have been here for a very long time. The steel of modern times is slightly better, but not profoundly better. In data centers, the cycle to replace the underlying building blocks, the microprocessors, is annual. You don't use the same microprocessor 5 years from now that you use today. That means you have to count those. When you count those, you get very different numbers than Goldman Sachs. We're already well past 2,000 terawatt hours of electricity used to build the infrastructure and operate the global cloud. And that's not the only thing we use information for. If you trap information technology spending broadly, these are the categories that are typically used: the hardware, software. Software, of course, only exists in hardware, so it's actually a hardware measure. It's a utilization function of hardware. And of course, telecom. And then there's this category that's been growing that's loosely new tech. By that, the analysts typically mean artificial intelligence, augmented reality, virtual reality, and robots. All those are growing because they're all getting more useful, because the economic value of compute is getting so good so fast. We enable new capacities, new kinds of things that can be done with compute. I happen to think the most interesting new capacity that compute allows is our robots, our mobile robots. I think so partly because they're no longer fictional. They're no longer theoretical. In my book, I map out the forecast for the next decade based on things that already exist, but they're underutilized. So if you looked at the purchase of global mobile robots, meaning wheeled or walking in some cases, in logistics, warehouses, and other forms of logistics and manufacturing, you can see we've already reached a tipping point of a dramatic increase in the global purchases in the logistics and manufacturing sector of robotics. This is a transformation of some consequence. So in the industrial sector, you probably know this, or maybe you don't, that 90% of all the industrial robots, industrial automation, exist in 10% of companies. So 90% of the companies have no automation, essentially none, except in the back office. They've got AI spreadsheets, and they do, the finance is automated, but the actual production process is not automated in 90% of manufacturing firms. That's because robots haven't been good enough to be either cheap enough or flexible enough or adaptive enough to work where humans work. The kinds of robots that can work with humans work are ones that are adaptive, resilient, inexpensive, and are compliant with our environment. That would be a mobile robot or even an anthropomorphic robot. I picked the anthropomorphic robot mostly because it's, well, frankly, it's kind of fun. I mean, C-3PO, Terminator, all the apocalyptic stories of science fiction about anthropomorphic robots. Humans have imagined anthropomorphic robots since Greek times. Jason and the Argonauts, go back and read your Greek history. The idea of automatons is very, very old. Turns out it's very, very hard to make a machine that can operate with humans. And the only way you can make a machine operate with humans is to kind of operate literally the way humans do. These are pictures of, I think it's almost a dozen companies that are pre-commercial or just commercial with anthropomorphic robots, which are designed primarily not to carry your groceries, but primarily for industrial logistics environments, especially for logistics environments where we have a labor shortage. To give you a sense of the technology's development, some of you who may be aficionados of Boston Dynamics, one of the robot companies, in their Atlas robot may have seen this video. They released this video. It's not CGI. It's a video of their latest robot, which is pre-commercial. You can't buy it yet. They are selling an anthropomorphic dog-like robot. It is commercial. It is sold, and it's used for inspection and industrial environments. They call it Spot, typical of engineers, Spot. But Spot walks around and does inspections with sensors and amplifies human inspectors. In fact, improves human inspectors because it's a boring job and safety is critical. But walking robots that are anthropomorphic are important as well. So this is a 15-second video. They released this in the summer of their latest incarnation. It'll give you a sense of how much the motor systems, control systems, the general technology has evolved with respect to building a machine that's not controlled by a joystick. It's not CGI, but autonomously stand up, move, walk around, pick things up. And to some people, this is a little spooky looking. I guess you could have that sensibility. But if you think in terms of where the workforce is challenged, walking robots are useful. In fact, Amazon is already operating in some of its warehouses with the Digits robot, which was designed to do a very specific task. The bins, when they're empty, are annoying. They have to be put somewhere. A human being has to move them. They couldn't find any way to automate it. So they built a special anthropomorphic robot that what it does is picks the bins up, puts them back where they need to be after they've been emptied by the picker, which is a human. This takes a human out of a very boring task, and it's a task that's achievable by a robot. Robocars, Elon Musk had his robo-taxi day. I'm a fan of Elon Musk. I'm not a fan of the particular car, but autonomous vehicles are inevitable. There's lots of them around now. They'll take a while to get cheap enough. And they will eventually show up. They'll probably show up first and foremost in dense urban cores, as they already are in San Francisco. And as they get safer and cheaper, better, more reliable, they'll become more commonly used. But they will increase the number of cars produced. They will increase the number of road miles. They will increase energy consumption, not decrease it. The trope that they drive more efficiently than humans is true. It's a true trope, but completely irrelevant. What will happen is if you look at the human factor, what people will do with autonomous vehicles, for example, this is a model developed by our own Energy and Information Administration looking at it, the assumption that autonomy was feasible. You would take your autonomous vehicle, because it'll be sized to have a bed in it, to do distances of 200 or 300 miles, Washington and New York, rather than flying or taking a train. And so all that short distance travel goes from very efficient cattle-like air travel and train travel to dispersed personal travel. All this is about productivity. The whole point of technology is to boost productivity. If we get a productivity boom from AI, and I think it's already begun, you get economic growth. If you get economic growth, you get demand for more stuff. More stuff begets more demand for more energy. If I want to track stuff, I could track stuff in a couple of ways. I could track microprocessors, not in dollars or a number of CPUs, but in tons of silicon moves. We make so many microprocessors now, we can now count them in kilotons. This is a graph of the tons of microprocessors produced. We're now approaching 20 kilotons. Kilotons, you're talking about things that are microns thick. We're moving 20 kilotons of those into the market every year. You can measure it in dollar terms in the logarithmic graph on your right. What you find is that the input to building things like the cloud, semiconductors, like previous periods where inputs like steel and plastics are used to build other infrastructures, are now sort of pari passu moving to $1 trillion a year of inputs. But keep in mind that $1 trillion of semiconductor inputs has much more economic value each marginal year than $1 trillion of plastic or steel, because, as you know, self-evidently, the next dollar spent on a semiconductor gets you far more value than the last dollar. That's never been true at the scales in history that we're now seeing. So to end on, the big picture where materials and energy, where Adam and Lee are, well, all this magic stuff, this incredible growth in the world that we've had for this last rough century. This is a graph for the last half century. It all distills to just four things. Stuff that we have to grow, build, dig up, and move. Biomass, which is food and fuel, wood for fuel. The construction materials themselves, which are typically gravel and concrete and all the lime. And then oil, gas, and coal measured in tons, and metals. So the world is now moving 100 gigatons of stuff a year to make civilization function. There's no dematerialization going on. The dematerialization trope is a myth. We lose less material per dollar, but we're using more absolute materials as we get more efficient, which drives growth. So where do you get the energy to move these materials, dig these materials up, combine these materials, and make them into stuff? Well, I'll compare three things at this level of just one power plant, 1 gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts. You could build one nuclear plant, which we know how to build. We don't know how to build SMRs yet. We will one day. But if you want to order a nuclear plant today, you'll do what the Chinese are doing. You'll build another 30 of these. Or you could build 10 gas turbines, 10 100 mega gas turbines. The nuclear plant might take you 5 years to build. The 10 gas turbines, you can probably, well, the order book's pretty tight right now, but absent the order book, you could get them in 6 months. And if you took somebody else's underused turbine, you could do this in way less than a year. Or you could be silly and build 1,000 3-megawatt wind turbines plus $10 billion of batteries to make the 1,000 wind turbines operate like a nuclear plant or a gas turbine. You don't have to be a physicist or an economist to know that the third is not an option that scales. And it won't scale, and it hasn't scaled. There's been no energy transition. The data show that the global consumption of the three primary hydrocarbons, oil, gas, and coal, have done nothing but increase continuously for all the last half century or the last century. You could pick your time frame. We've spent $10 trillion in the last 15 years to avoid using oil, gas, and coal. I put it to you on the left graph. How did that work out in avoiding increasing oil, gas, and coal? If you measure it in a different way, the per capita use of oil, gas, and coal by the world, which is really the way to measure it, you see no transition of any kind. In fact, if there's anything like a transition, it's oil slipped a little bit per capita, but natural gas is taking off, and the coal, so you see the coal boom from China, which, by the way, unless we ship LNG to India, China will generate a coal boom that will look just like the Chinese coal boom. So India will. So the trope that we can build batteries and long transmission lines, it's always sunny somewhere to make this great transition happen, is arithmetically and meteorologically silly. The wind is variable seasonally, not just by the hour. The sun is variable seasonally, not just by the hour. And you get both solar and wind droughts. That is, periods of time for which there's no wind and no sun simultaneously continent-wide. We know that's true because we have meteorological data that shows it happens dozens of times over the decades that you build grids. What that translates into is that if you wanted to build enough batteries for the United States for just a one-day drought, bearing in mind that multi-day droughts occur regularly, that's $4 trillion of batteries at tomorrow's, not today's, battery prices. So I'll close by pointing out that I know I'm running against the renewable energy trope. There is no renewable energy. There's no such thing as renewable energy. All machines are needed to make energy from nature. All machines wear out. So the only metric that matters is how much material you need to extract from the earth to make the machines. We know from IEA data that the wind, solar, and battery path increases the material requirement from the earth for critical metals by 1,000%. 1,000% increase to deliver the same energy services to society. Apple, God bless them, had a study undertaken by academics to look at the, quote, dematerialization trope. And what they pointed out in a very useful illustrative summary is that to get all the metals and minerals we need, except for steel, phosphate, but the critical metals like copper, neodymium, praseodymium, cobalt, manganese, magnesium, all the basket of things that make all modern technologies possible. We currently mine about 7,000 Great Pyramids worth of rock a year to deliver metals and minerals to civilization. The green path would require that we mine 50,000 Great Pyramids of rock a year to deliver the same energy output. That won't happen. But we sort of start along that path. If you graph the kilotons of silicon that China produces, which is 90% of the world's solar silicon, China burns now 300 million tons of coal a year to produce the silicon for the world. I'll put it in more personal terms. If you are one of those who love to have your solar panel on your roof, and assume that you have a modest-sized house, not a big house, you personally cost 30 tons of Chinese coal to be burned to make the solar cells to go on your roof. If we chase all the metals and minerals needed for batteries for cars, we'll be producing gigawatt hours of batteries and inducing gigatons of mining in Africa. We already mine by the gigaton, but we'll increase that mining by 1,000%. I'll close with the final sort of two hand-waving things. One is the magic of technology. This category error that we have an exponential energy tech trend underway. You see this word thrown around all the time, and an embarrassing misuse of the word exponential. There are no exponential trends in energy tech. There are exponential trends in information technology. Energy does not scale the way information does. Moore's law is the red line in this graph. That's the rate at which a Moore's law trend moves. The y-axis is the energy density of a battery in a car. The blue dots are the actual energy density of batteries going in that are available for cars from 1990 through 2022, and the little DOE goal. What you'll see are two things. There's no exponential trend, and you'll see that it's flattened out as we've sort of reached the asymptote of the utility of that particular class of electricity storage. This is not going to change. There's, in the laws of physics that we know, exponential trends in energy technologies are in comic books. Iron Man's a little power pack in his chest. If energy technology followed exponential trends, a single solar cell would end up the size of a postage stamp and power the Empire State Building. That will never happen, except in comic books. A battery on an exponential trend would soon be the size of your laptop computer and would power an A380 to Asia round trip. That will never happen. So next time you hear the babbling about exponential trends in green tech and energy tech, know the category error is profound. Finally, Adam mentioned what they know about the energetics of EVs. What's more important than the energetics of EVs? There's going to be lots of EVs in the world. They're very useful, a lot of use functions. Be tens of millions, hundreds of millions of them. But they don't reduce CO2 emissions. The gray dotted lines that I've grayed out is the conventional way of illustrating accurately by both Volvo and Volkswagen and other analysts when the crossover occurs that driving your EV leads to fewer CO2 emissions than driving a conventional vehicle. Put differently, the energy debt and CO2 emissions to make the EV and its half-ton battery, all of its copper and aluminum, manganese, has a CO2 debt that's not paid off for 50,000 to 60,000 miles. And at that point, your EV on a conventional grid emits somewhat less CO2. But that's a static picture. It's not a real picture. If you look at the next generation of internal combustion engines, that's your bottom red line. And if you look at the marginal energy costs and therefore CO2 emissions for each marginal ton of copper, each marginal ton of nickel, what you find is the real CO2 emissions from an EV are the top green line. Or put differently, EVs will almost certainly increase global CO2 emissions, not decrease it. And their whole rationale is about decreasing CO2 emissions. So I'll close with a prediction that's sort of a macro relevant to thinking about economies and how technology influences investing. We're going to see inflation. I mean, we're spending the money. The $2 trillion of money tied up in the Inflation Reduction Act. If the Republicans run the table, they'll probably rein it in, but they're not going to kill it. They don't have the spine. They should novate it. It should be gone, ended, done. It's terrible. It's inflationary. $2 trillion of new money spent to produce the same stuff, energy that we already produce cheaply. So we're gonna face inflation on both energy and materials. We're gonna use and produce more oil and gas. We're gonna produce more solar cells, probably mostly in China. We'll produce more EVs, mostly in China. We're going to do a lot more mining in the future. We have to. And a lot more robots and AI will be deployed to do the mining, in fact, and to build the other machines. And we're going to see a renaissance in nuclear energy. It's just that it won't happen as the idealists and the naive, I guess I would say in an embarrassing way, a lot of this like seals clapping the Embarcadero about nuclear energy going to solve all these problems. No, it's not. I love nukes. There's going to be lots of nukes in the world. They take a long time to build, and we haven't proven out the next generation yet. I'd love to see it accelerated, and God willing, the tech giants will flow hundreds of billions of dollars into that space so you and I don't have to do it through our taxpayer dollars. Thank you. I'll do a couple minutes of questions. If there are questions or objections briefly, I'm happy to field questions. And if you have an objection, I just want to tell you in advance, you're wrong. Just so you know, that's just kidding. Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, I do. I have a lot of thoughts about quantum computing. It's very, we will have quantum computers one day that are true quantum computers. We really don't have those yet, but I think they will happen. There'll be a special use case, classic computing, because they do a specific form of inference in a sense. They don't do calculations, as you probably know. But what they will do is reduce energy consumption per unit of compute function, whatever they do. So they will continue and accelerate the trend. So the trends that I showed for TSMC for conventional silicon, they will eventually plateau. We hit what's called the KT limit, the physics limits of noise and compute. We'll hit that probably in the next 20 years. And probably in the next 20 years, we'll have new classes of compute, whether it's positronics doing quantum compute, and that will just continue the trend. So what that means is a really interesting pivot. You know, one never uses a line, this time it's different, right? We all know that in investing. But I'll tell you one thing that is different this time. There's never been a product, a commodity, for which there's infinite demand. All products and commodities you can predict their saturation or demand. Food and even cars, people only so many hours in a car, so many hours in an airplane. But data doesn't have any limit. There's no limit to how much information we want to have about things in nature and ourselves and our body and life. And that means that particular domain of hardware feeding this infinite demand for data is really weird. And quantum computing will accelerate it, but it's not. I think it's not as silly as fusion being always 50 years away. I think we're only 20 years away from quantum compute. Yes, sir. The question was Intel have a chance to catch up to TSMC? I mean, TSMC is a monster moat. I love Intel. I mean, I worked for its competitor back at the dawn of time. I think they got a problem. They got a problem. I just don't know how they catch up. The lead is so great, but they could be doing Skunkworks project that I'm not aware of and have something. IBM's been trying to catch up on GPUs with NVIDIA. I think roughly speaking, NVIDIA's moat gets breached. Inevitably, it will get breached, especially if their principal IP at the moment is not the chip, it's in the operating system for the chip. And that's the easiest thing for somebody else to figure out how to do, in a sense. Whereas the hardware moat, that one is, they don't make anything. They're a contract manufacturer, like TSMC. So other people can use TSMC. But I think they have a 2 or 3 year moat. It feels like that. So I'm not picking price targets on NVIDIA because it's so in the stratosphere. But prices, as you all know better than me, are driven by emotions and psychology more than fundamentals. And the emotion is driven by a truth. AI is a big deal. We need more AI chips than the world can produce. We already know there are use cases that are valuable. I mean, not deep fakes that embarrass Trump or Harris. I mean, that's fun. That's the best use of deep fakes, I think. The second best is to have a system that can tell you when it is a deep fake. That's really, really hard. So I think Intel is not going to, I don't think it goes bankrupt. I think it becomes the also ran because we still need that class of compute. It's just that it's a commodity. So it's like growing grain. Sir, you had a.
Seem like it would be fair to conclude that at least in the longer term that the green/renewable energy movement is irrational. So what's your explanation for the enormous sums of money that are being spent by supposedly smart institutions?
Yeah. The question is, it appears based on my conviction, but also where the data are, that the green claims for green energy are overstated, hyped, probably irrational. So how come we're spending so much money? Right now, the US and Europe are spending $1 trillion a year on non-oil, non-gas stuff, mostly wind, solar, and batteries. $1 trillion a year. So the climate clean tech industrial complex is $1 trillion a year of wealth transfer, which I would add is profoundly immoral because it's draining $1 trillion a year of capital from productivity driving investments. But the why question is the psychiatry, not the physics question. So as a physicist, it's clearly energetically insane to think you could do everything with solar and batteries. It just doesn't. The arithmetic doesn't work. You don't even, and the physics doesn't take you to things that make it work. Period. However, we're human beings, and we have that old aphorism about democracy doing experiments that, we can afford the $1 trillion a year mistake. We can because we're a wealthy country. I'm sad to see us spend that kind of money, but it will collapse because it won't do what is claimed. It's already clear that's the case. So why is it happening? So as an amateur psychiatrist, and I debated the nuclear debates after 3 Mile Island for years and developed a taxonomy. And it's the Pareto law, the 80-20 rule. Though 80% of people on any issue don't pay that much attention and kind of sort of worry or believe something that's been told to them. They worry about climate, therefore green's good. They worry about nukes being dangerous, therefore shut the nukes down. That's sort of 80% of people, including well-educated, because you're busy. And you read the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, their news pages are not that much different. Their ed pages are. So you have this zeitgeist, but they're not attentive. The 20% are in 2 buckets that are attentives, and they are the true believers and the kleptocrats. So the true believers are impenetrable and they really believe whatever they're saying is true. The world's going to end. It's an apocalypse. It's just silly. But they really believe we have to do this, and you can't penetrate them. And the other 10% they're getting something from it. They're kleptocrats. I mean, I don't mean overtly, but implicitly. They're making money. They're selling turbines. There's wind turbines. They're selling consulting services on, predicting the sea level rise. It's going to inundate a coastal area. So that's the whole climate industrial complex. There's a lot of money in it. And in any social system, again, this is me being an amateur studying history, you find the Pareto rule works. The 10 or 20% that are noisy drive the system for a while because they're noisy and they're active. The other 80% are busy and they're not active until the consequence of the 10 or 20% impact the 80%. And then they say, enough. So I think we're at peak green spending, right more or less around now. Whatever the election outcome will be peak green spending because it's inflationary and destructive. And the rest of the world's ignoring it. I mean, profoundly. China's adding more coal capacity. If we eliminated all of our coal plants that are remaining, they will add more coal burn in the next 5 years than we'll eliminate. And they won't close those coal plants down for 50 years. And they will manufacture the copper and refine it and the silicon that we need from their coal-fired plants. This is a silly trade, economically and politically speaking. So it's peak green. People believe it because they believe the story, a narrative. You talked about a narrative. Narratives are powerful. Apocalypse stories are great. Who doesn't love apocalypse stories? That's what makes great science fiction. One more? Okay, then we can. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. So so the question was, there's a lot of hype around nukes. So how durable is the investment theme? Where would you enter it? How would you enter it? So I would very simply at a high level, you really have sort of three domains. It's typical of all industrial things. The machine builders, right? Like the Caterpillars of the world, right? People that build the machines, and the power plants themselves. So the small reactors, big reactors, Hitachis, whatever. And then you have the intermediaries in all these industrial environments that do all the infrastructure, that do the supply chain. And then you have the underlying commodities. Those are the three buckets. So I'm sort of with Adam and Lee. I have opinions. I can tell you how I think this is going to play out, but they all need uranium. And yeah, I know about thorium cycle and all that. Thorium works, but it's irrelevant. It's going to be uranium. And so if you believe society has finally got sane again and we need nuclear energy, then you should be long uranium. You don't have to guess the rest, in effect. If you try to make a specific play on what will be built in the next 5-10 years, we will build what we know how to build, which is the existing kind of light water reactors. So anybody in that supply chain that does that benefits from when the orders come in, it'll be build what we know how to build. SMRs will be the small reactors, the micro reactors. This is going to be, a lot of fun. It's going to be a great lottery of betting on a next generation reactor, which will be overvalued in terms of what it can deliver, when it can deliver, but deserving the excitement. So if I were doing a portfolio hedge, I'd pick those three domains. I'd look at, the Oklos of the world. I'd make a bet on one of them or a few of them in a basket. I'd bet on the middle guys, BWX, you got to make fuel. I'm bullish the fuel makers. They're hard to do. Cameco, obviously. I worked for its predecessor when I was in Canada, my first energy job. So you do that, but the real one that you can't avoid is you need uranium. Just need the uranium. And the world, if it doesn't shut down reactors, and it's not going to shut down many reactors anymore, they need a lot of uranium. So I think, Adam and Lee's analysis looking at that was wise, first because you need it, and secondly because you don't have to guess the other stuff. Thank you.
Okay, so we can break for lunch, and there'll be lunch served just outside here, where there's breakfast as well. And we'll resume here at 1:15. So we'll shorten the lunchtime a little bit. We ran a little bit over, and we'll meet back here at 1:15.